Hey everybody, welcome to part 4 in a series of videos for Three Kingdoms Redux. Now this is the final video in the series. In this video I'm going to give you my final opinions of the game. Now if you've been a fan of my channel for a while and watched any of my prior videos, you probably have heard me mention a couple times that I am a huge fan of the Asian theme, especially when it comes to any kind of board game or game of any kind that involves 4X or similar to 4X, explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. I've always loved those kind of games. Matter of fact, in the 80s, I played a ton of Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Nobunaga's Ambition. Both those were basically 4X style games where your objective was to build up your resources, expand across the map, and basically take over dominance of the entire map. So basically, Three Kingdoms Redux pretty much had me at hello, and I'm not afraid to admit that. When I heard that this was a board game that pretty much emulates those games, while being a worker placement game, which is another genre of games I really do enjoy. Matter of fact, if I would ever rate my top 100 games, I would be willing to bet that Lords of Waterdeep would probably, if not hit my top 120, it would probably come very, very close. I just enjoy those style of games quite a bit. I enjoy doing the kind of games where you're trying to compete with different locations and you're trying to be the first person to achieve one of those locations. And that's what I really like about this game. It has worker placement, but it also has worker placement with a twist. Now, before we go anywhere further with this game, there's a couple quick things I want to mention that I want to give very high thumbs up, very high kudos, and very high praise to the people who produce this game. Now, my understanding is this game was produced by a company called Starting Player, and this is their very first game, and they pretty much knocked it out of the ballpark here with their very first game. You have a game that has some fantastic design just with the board, probably one of the best rule books I've read in a long time. I was literally able to read the rule book, and between the rule book, actually I didn't need the player aids to be honest with you, but between the rule book and the player aids, I was able to figure out how to play this game extremely easy. Matter of fact, my only difficulty with the game was the fact that I have a horrible time trying to pronounce the different names of all these generals. So you probably noticed in my videos, I didn't even try because I was not going to embarrass myself that much. I'm sure some of you remember the Firefly fiasco when I tried to pronounce names in that game. But before we go on to painful reminders, let's get back on topic here. They did a fantastic job of designing this board, just starting with the board itself. The board is very large. There's plenty of room to put all your pieces down on the board. Plenty of room for all these places for all your different actions you're going to be battling for or trying to get those locations. The battle locations, there's reminder markers all over the board. Matter of fact, it's so well done with this board. It is very easily possible to play this game once you know how to play the game, once you understand the rules. You'll never need this rule book ever again because there's reminders for everything on this board. You have reminders for the starting locations, for all the tribal relations, for every single player on the board. You have reminders on the board. If I move these cards out of the way really quickly, there's reminders on the board for every single one of these locations telling you exactly whether it's a combat location, whether it's an administrative location. You have icons on the board which are very easy to understand, very easy to read, to let you know exactly which every one of these locations, what they do, how you access those locations, and what benefits they're going to give you. There's a nice reminder on the board which locations can accept the alliance token. There's reminders on the battle spaces showing you how to add up everything. There's reminders for all these different provinces letting you know what kind of units can compete for those. There are wonderful reminders all over the game, whether it's just the general tokens reminding you of the stats of all the generals so you don't have to keep referencing back to the generals themselves. They did a fantastic job of putting all the information you need in multiple places so you never feel like this is one of those games where you have to memorize everything because everything is plainly laid out, plainly in front of you for you to figure out exactly how to play the game, and you're never going to have one of those instances where you're going to say, everybody, stop. Okay, I know that rule book was in here somewhere in the rules. Okay, everybody stop the game while I'm trying to find that rule. You're never going to do that with this game because between these player aids, which are all done very well, double-sided, it even has the general powers for your opponents, so you can start watching their strategies and figuring out what they're doing and why they're doing it. But everything is done so well with just the design of this game. I just want to give 100% double thumbs up just to how well they put forethought in this game to make sure that you're never going to have a problem learning to play this game, getting it to the table, and figuring out how to play it without having to reference that rulebook dozens of times, which is something that's pretty darn awesome for a game that's a worker placement game, a little bit more of a complex worker placement game with lots of different ways to score, lots of different ways to earn victory points, and lots of different strategies to play the game. I also enjoy how they managed to make a very asymmetrical game where you have 3 different states who have 3 different sets of generals, all with different powers, while some of the generals may be kind of close on some of the powers. For example, this general gets extra gold when he does an alliance space. This person gets extra rice when he does an alliance space, so they're kind of similar. But you have to understand there's about 45 different generals, just doing the quick math off the top of my head. I may think there's actually 60 now that I think about it. But there's different generals in this game that all have different powers. And here's the really cool thing about all these generals. Every one of these generals feels really cool, very, very powerful, and none of them ever feel weak. So it's very awesome how when you're picking out your generals, just trying to pick out your generals when you're first starting the game, that's just the basic starting of the strategy of the game, because every one of these generals have different powers, different abilities that can be brought out into play at various different stages of the game. Some generals are better to bring out early in the game. Some generals are better to bring out later in the game. But what I think is very cool, the way the game is designed, how you can pick your generals at the start of the game, allows you to pick your strategy based on the generals you pick, based on the unification cards you manage to happen to draw, and also the separation cards you happen to draw. And it creates a very cool game where, like I said, it's all very asymmetric, but all the generals feel very cool. They also bring very unique powers to the game, changes the strategy of the game, which guarantees the game is never going to feel samey. At least it has not felt samey for me yet. Every single time I played the game has felt very different, thanks to a different draw of generals, a different draw of cards for the separation, the unification, ensuring that I played a different strategy every single time I play the game, whether it's as the Wei player, as the Wu player, or as the Shu player. Now I am going to say one little segue here. Each one of these generals do have to play to a kind of a strategy they have to stick to, because in the beginning, well, I got to word this a little differently. In the beginning, the Shu player is pretty much shoehorned into a role, because in the beginning of the game, the Shu player has to rely on the alliance token because they do not have enough generals to go out there and try to take these spaces. So the Shu player has to convince the Wu player to help them in a little bit in the beginning, but you have to convince them to help you in a way that also helps them, which is really cool. And that comes up to the next thing I really like about the game. That's going to be the alliance tokens. Now, in all honesty, just talking mechanically, the alliance token, in all honesty, is just a veiled catch-up mechanism. Basically, whoever's in third place gets to control the alliance token. They get to pick whichever space is going to be used for them, although I'm going to talk about this in just a second. Now, this is an offensive and a defensive weapon, but they get to control which space is going to be the alliance space. So whoever happens to fall into third place in the bidding order is always going to control the alliance space. Of course, they want to talk with the player in second place and see if they can hash out a deal, work out some kind of arrangement that's going to be mutually beneficial. But the really cool thing about this is that whenever you're in third place, you have a lot of control, because you can look at who's in first place and convince the player in second place that you either need to pick a place that's beneficial for both of you, or you need to pick a place that's going to mess up the player in first order as much as possible, because you have an offensive and a defensive use for the alliance token. You can use it defensively and say, hey, Wu and Shu, let's make a deal here. We both know that we need armies, so let's go and put the alliance here in the recruit army space so we can both get armies. And you may think that's a good idea. Or you may sit back and decide, oh, you know what? The Wei player really, really needs food right now, because if he does not get food, he's going to start getting negative victory points because he can no longer feed his armies. So let's take this space, ensuring that if he wants a space badly enough to start paying for his armies, he's going to have to throw a lot of generals at that location and try to lock that location back in. So now the alliance has gone from a defensive ploy to an offensive ploy. So it's not quite just a catch-up mechanic. It's also a mechanic that can help you form alliances. They're going to constantly shift, constantly break, constantly be remade, which is very thematic and fitting to the theme of Three Kingdoms. Speaking of the theme, they also did a really fantastic job of matching the theme of the game, where in the beginning of the game, the Wei player has much more generals, feels like they're much more powerful, and they have much more control of the board space in the beginning of the game, while the Shu and the Wu players in the beginning of the game need to work together and try to slow down the Wei player, because in the beginning, the Wei player has most of the power, while the Shu player in the beginning is the weakest. But the balance of power as the game goes on is going to constantly shift between the players. As players start taking player order number one, as they start going out there and going through all the different locations, and again, every turn with 3, 5, and 9, when every single player is going to start gaining extra generals that they're going to add to the army. And by the time we get to the 9th round, every single player is going to have the exact same amount of generals in the game, assuming that they haven't sent them out to these border regions to start gaining the victory points for those extra locations. And that's another really cool thing about the game. You have multiple ways to score your victory points. You can score victory points by going out to your border regions. You can go score victory points by doing your army. You can score victory points by going out there and becoming better with the renown, or sorry, with the renown, you can get unification victory points, separation victory points. There's tons of different ways to earn victory points in this game. And you never can focus on everything, because if you focus on everything, you're never going to be able to get everything. So you're going to end up floundering as the game goes on. So it's really cool how it goes. And finally, one other thing I really enjoyed about this game is, well, most games, and we're pretty used to worker placement games, where they're going to end at the end of a certain amount of rounds. The cool thing about this game is the players are actually in control of the end game victory conditions, because the game can come to an end when one of the other victory conditions are brought to the end. But just because you manage to end the game doesn't mean you're necessarily going to win the game, because you can win the game by becoming the new emperor. You can win the game by getting the best marketplaces and best farms going. Basically, you've managed to create the most efficient use of your resources, and you can end the game that way. Or you can end the game by getting your generals out here on multiple different locations, conquering 5 different locations, and then winning the game that way also. And I'll even put my generals on the right location just to make sure I do this correctly. But if you manage to get your generals out there in 5 different locations, you're also going to win the game. But you need to watch how you're putting your generals out there, because they're best with certain weapons, so you need to match up their weapons. But you can't always do that, because sometimes you just need to get these victory point tokens for the resources they're going to give you, because you're not always going to have enough resources, because there's a constant drain on your economy, because you need to be constantly paying gold every single round for your armies. You need to be constantly paying food every single round for your armies. Otherwise, you're going to start getting these negative victory point tokens, which can be worth -3 victory points every single round, that you're going to not have the resources to pay for these armies, and that drain is going to cost you the game. Now, I do need to caution you about a few things about Three Kingdoms Redux. This is very much a very strategic game versus a tactical game. This is one of those games where you need to be planning multiple rounds in advance and not trying to react to what's going on in the immediate current round. Now, granted, the game does have more than enough separation cards that you're never going to see all of them in a single turn. There's more unification cards than you ever see in a single turn. There's definitely more general cards for every single player than you'll ever see in a single game. So there is lots of replay variety, and there's lots of variety in the fact that you're never going to be playing exactly the same way every single time you play it. But the game is still very strategic, because you need to be constantly planning multiple rounds in advance when you're playing the game. And that's going to be very hard for newer players to figure out when they're playing the game. You need to be figuring out, when is it time to start getting your marketplaces, when do you need to start working on your farms, because you want to make sure that you have the resources available when you start moving your armies out into these provinces, because if you don't have the resources to pay for your armies when they start accessing these provinces, you're going to start getting this drain on your economy. So you need to start planning on that aspect. You also need to start planning exactly when do you want to get these separation cards into play, because if you don't get them into play soon enough, it becomes impossible to play and get these separation cards into play. But the unfortunate thing is you can only get one of these cards into play every single turn, unless it happens to be the alliance space. So you're going to be constantly battling on whether it's time to get a unification card into play to help you earlier in the game when they become much more powerful, because the longer the separation cards are in play, the longer they help you. But if you wait too long, you won't be able to get your unification cards into play, which creates another little bit of strategic versus tactical play, which means, again, you're going to be playing for the long-term benefits of this game. You're not playing for the current round. You're always planning multiple rounds in advance. That's going to be a little bit difficult for new players to figure out when they're trying to learn how to play Three Kingdoms Redux. Players are also going to feel overwhelmed when they're first learning how to play the game, because you're going to have all these powers of all these generals. You're going to be trying to take the best advantage of all these generals that you can, so you can use their abilities to the best of your ability to give your empire and your state the best benefits you can gain. But you're going to be relying on these locations and the powers of your generals, and then somebody's going to come along and take a space away from you that you're trying so hard to get, and that's going to mess with your strategy. And that's basically going to bring the point I'm trying to get to. When you're learning this game, especially with the new players, expect mean old Mr. Analysis Paralysis to pop his head in here every now and then, because players are going to have so many options between their separation, between their unification, between their generals, trying to figure out exactly which generals they want to bring into play on every one of the turns when they get the generals, trying to compete for all these different locations. And not only that, the Shu player is going to be the one who's going to feel the most overwhelmed when you're learning how to play the game, because in a way they're going to feel like they're picked on, and I guess it's probably not the best word to use, but the Shu player starts with the least amount of generals, which means they have the least amount of chance of getting these locations, because they don't want to ever get in a bidding war for a location in the early stages of the game, because you simply do not have the generals to afford. So the Shu player in the beginning of the game has to play a very interesting game where they're relying almost completely on the alliance space, trying to make sure that they pick an alliance space that's going to help their empire the most efficiently while not giving too much of a benefit to their ally, while doing as much as they can to slow down the Wei player until they can start evening the field and start bringing up their strategy and start compensating for all the deficits they start with in the beginning of the game. So yes, I believe that this is a fantastic game, but I also believe that this is going to be a rough game for players to learn, to get good at. It's going to be one of those games that players are going to play multiple times to start learning all the strategies of each one of the states, the strategies of every one of the generals, the strategy of the unification, the separation cards. When is it a good time to bring out separation cards? When is a good time for the unification cards? And when exactly you want to start going for which spaces to get which victory points and start locking in your strategies. It's going to feel overwhelming for new players. Now there's two other little minor points for Three Kingdoms Redux, and that's going to affect different groups in different single ways. Well, at least the first point is going to affect different groups in different ways. Now Three Kingdoms Redux is a 3-player and a 3-player only game, and that's probably going to be the biggest difficulty going forward for Three Kingdoms Redux, because lots of play groups are 2 players, lots of play groups are 4 and 5 players. Play groups of exactly 3 players are a little bit more on the rare side. It's very common for 2-player games because you have your couples who enjoy playing board games, and you also have your families, which is usually about 4 people on average. So it's going to be a little bit harder for Three Kingdoms to get to the table. Matter of fact, when I was trying to get to the table, I actually had to arrange special get-togethers with friends just to make sure I had exactly 3 players every single time we got down to sit down and play this game, which was a little bit more of a challenge. I think that is going to be a little bit of a challenge for Three Kingdoms Redux when it's trying to gain the attention of people, because I think it's a fantastic game. I think a lot of people are going to enjoy it, but I do think that 3-player play limit is going to be a little bit of a setback for the game, at least to get it to the table for some players. One other minor thing, I would have loved for the box to be just a little bit thicker or a little bit taller. Now everything in this box fits in there perfectly snugly with no room for anything once you have everything bagged up. I would love for the box to be just a little bit bigger so I can put a Plano style box in there so I can keep all these components perfectly organized in the box. Otherwise, basically every time you're playing the game, you're pulling everything out of baggies, because that's about all the room you have in the bag or the box, and you're unbagging everything and you're setting everything up, and that kind of slows things down. I would have loved it if all these basic white components that are standard for every single time you play the game, if I could have just slipped a Plano box right in there, that would have made me very, very happy to have that included in the game. The bottom line here, though, is that Three Kingdoms Redux is a fantastic game. It's designed extremely well. It's very asymmetric. You have lots of replay variety due to a variety of cards that you're not going to see all the cards in every single game you play. The game's going to play differently every single time you play it. It's a worker placement game with a little bit of a twist, since there's a little bit of an auction mechanic. I love how the players are in control of the end game. They're in control of multiple ways to score, and I really, really enjoyed the theme of the game. I hope you enjoyed this video series for Three Kingdoms Redux. If you have any comments or questions, as always, leave them in the YouTube comments down below. You can also feel free to email me at offtheshelfboardgamereviews, that's otsbgr@gmail.com. As always, if you like this video series and you want to see more just like them, click that like button, click that subscribe button. As always, thanks for watching.